I really don't know how to start this one. This is a big video. Hello everyone, my name's Josh from Videos by Josh, and it has been 10 years since Sony launched the E-mount. And to celebrate Sony and its accomplishment, in this video, I'm going to go over and give my impressions on every single camera in the Sony Alpha lineup. Let me be more specific. I'm going to go over every full frame camera in the Sony Alpha lineup, which over 10 years, well, there's a lot of them. We know the Sony Alpha line as essentially the bread and butter of Sony's professional offerings. Photographers and videographers alike have been using these cameras to create incredible video and imagery over the last 10 years. And it's hard to believe that when this line started, mirrorless was kind of an unproven concept. Like, everyone was still shooting on DSLRs even for video, and boy has that changed. A little bit about my history with Sony. I've been a fully invested E-mount shooter since about 2016. I started a small commercial video production company in Winnipeg, Manitoba, off the back of my old A7S II. From there, I transitioned to many different Sony cameras, the A7 III, the A7S III, and finally into the FX line. I'm sure there's better people to give their opinions on Sony cameras, but because of my history with the brand, I thought I'd give it a shot. Also, I want to clarify that I'm not going to be including any of their crop sensor cameras, not because they're not professional or of substantial quality. There's some incredible crop sensor cameras. I think this list would be too long if I did, and honestly, I don't have a lot of experience in their crop sensor portfolio, so for this video, I'm leaving them out. So I think that's it. Strap in, because we're going to be going over a lot of cameras in this video, and we're going to start where it all began.
Full frame, palm size.
On October 16th, 2013, Sony released the A7 camera, the first camera in the A7 line and the first full-frame mirrorless camera from Sony. And if you can remember back to when that camera launched, that was a big deal. Everyone was shooting on DSLRs. Nobody even knew that mirrorless was going to be a thing. It was a really interesting proof of concept and showed that Sony was going to come out swinging with their E-mount. Now, they had to sacrifice some features. For any of those OG A7 users, you'll know that it wasn't exactly the best value at the time. When you had cameras like the Canon 5D Mark III coming off the back of Magic Lantern, Infamy, and like its incredible shooting profiles, and you had to choose this kind of quirky upstart mirrorless, like, it wasn't an easy choice. When you had no touch focus, no touch screen, no IBIS, you had a 5 FPS photo shooter, no electronic shutter, you had a really interesting, smaller, more delicate feeling camera than some of the beefy DSLRs that Canon and Nikon were putting out. But as longtime Sony shooters will know, the body style for the A7 series was pretty much cooked out of the gate. Like, this looks like an up-to-date camera. This is essentially the body style that they committed to. You could shoot in HD, but the video quality was not up to par. This was a good entry into the space and more of a proof of concept for Sony.
The first full-frame mirrorless Alpha 7.
Only a short few months later, still in 2013, Sony released what would be an iconic moniker for the A line, and that is the Sony A7R, the R standing for resolution, which is a type of branding that Sony would maintain in their A7 line. Like the A7, this camera shared a lot of similarities. Pretty much the exact same body, almost the same feature set. The difference is you're getting many more megapixels. Instead of the standard 24.3 in the A7, you are now getting 36.4. This was the professional photographer's choice in the A7 line at the time. I've never used this camera personally. I don't doubt it took amazing pictures. People were still very skeptical of the mirrorless line at this time, and thus continued to use similar offerings from Nikon and Canon. Next, we fly down the calendar and pass a few months, and what do we have? On April 6, 2014, we have the launch of the A7S. S standing for sensitivity. This was an interesting direction for the brand to take. They already had two A7 cameras, and now they're introducing a third. This camera, at the time, was more focused towards video shooters. It had 12 megapixels instead of the 24 or 36, which might confuse you because it doesn't sound better, but what the A7 line has long touted is high sensitivity in dark environments. Now, this camera wasn't the flagship knock in the park as some of the later iterations of this line. It was good at the time for video, and it shot decent quality HD. It maintained the same Sony body, but lacked a lot of the common features that we have come to know in these cameras. Most noticeable, a lack of IBIS. Something I didn't talk about with the other cameras, and this one included, is Sony came out of the gate with some pretty confusing menus as well. The trope of Sony cameras having very difficult to interpret menus, yeah, that came right out of the gate. So this was Sony's original A7 offering. They had a lot of work to do, as these cameras didn't appeal to a lot of photography traditionalists. A lot of people were used to the built-out bodies of DSLRs. Comparatively, these mirrorless cameras, even with their grips, were relatively delicate. But what people were clamoring to at the time is the fact that you got a live view of whatever you were shooting. Looking through the viewfinder, you can see exactly what your exposure changes would do to your scene. While in DSLRs, you look through a mirror, which didn't communicate changes to your exposure until you took your picture. In video mode, DSLRs would just open the mirror and pass through the information into the sensor, and then you could see what you were doing. But for photography, there was a genuine quality of life improvement, as amateurs and professionals alike could now better gauge what they were trying to shoot. Sony laid it all out on the field with the offerings of these three initial cameras. It's tough to accurately gauge what people were thinking at that time, given that I didn't enter the space in the original offering of these Sony cameras. I think everyone appreciated the fact that Sony was paving a new direction for cameras, and the new updated technology, despite being practically disadvantageous in certain ways, could be appreciated by those looking for something innovative in cameras. Then we wait several months, going down to November 20th, 2014. In 1 year and 1 month, Sony came out with a successor to the A7, and that was the A7 II. And now we have the first camera on this list that I've actually attempted to use professionally. I like the A7 II. If I was to go back to it in current time, I would definitely miss a lot of features. But I would say that as a photography camera, it holds up. For photography, you have an upgraded 24 megapixel sensor. This is the first A7 camera to introduce IBIS, so now you have 5-axis image stabilization. We have the same shutter speed limitations at 1/8000th of a second. We can shoot 5 frames per second without live view, but we still don't have an electronic shutter. Talking more about the body of the camera, the A7 II also maintained the 1 SD card slot, which was a pain point amongst shooters who are more accustomed to 2. It also continued the lineage of having a really weird placed record button. Like, the record button for the A7 II was like way off to the side on the grip. Like, I get it, like that's where your thumb is, but it was very weird. I never liked that. The A7 II was a competent photography camera. I didn't love it for video. It shot fine HD. It was a little soft in my experience with my camera, but it surely was a step in the right direction. A comparatively big gap to jump was the jump into the A7R II. 7 months later, on June 10th, 2015, Sony launched the A7R II. This was a nice upgrade to its predecessor and a treat for high-resolution photographers. It got the same 5-axis IBIS from the A7 II, but unfortunately it maintained the same middling performance shooting speed at only 2.5 frames per second with live view enabled. That's pretty slow by today's standard. The video was comparatively on par, and overall this camera was a very similar offering to the A7 II. Whoa, hey, editing Josh here. I just realized that I said the next camera is the first Sony camera that recorded 4K video. It was actually the A7R II. This camera was the first camera, full-frame mirrorless camera from Sony to record internal 4K video, so big ups to the A7R II, and ignore what I say in the next bit. It was a bump in resolution, and A7R shooters found themselves in a nice upgrade path. The next camera is, in my opinion, the first legend. A legendary offering from Sony coming only 3 months and a day after. On September 11th, 2015, Sony announced the A7S II. This camera lives in infamy and is one of my favorite of Sony's older offerings. I built the back of my early stage professional portfolio off this camera. This camera was a lot of video shooters' introduction to Sony, and you can scour the internet to find a plethora of short films and even comprehensively budgeted productions that use the A7 II for some shots. This camera was a game changer for video. It maintained the same 12 megapixels. I mean, the strategy is to have high sensitivity in low light, and high sensitivity it did. Because in addition to great low light performance, good reliability, a nice form factor that can be put in small spaces when compared to larger cameras, you know what this camera also offered? 4K recording. You could also record in slow motion, going up to 120 FPS in 1080, although that was a soft 120 FPS. This camera was a light-hungry monster that delivered a professional quality image time and time again. At this point, people were starting to see that Sony had an actual professional quality offering in the video department for their cameras. This camera was big. This is where we started to see a power shift between the camera brands. Cameras from Canon, like the 5DS, were getting knocked off in favor of a Sony product. Micro Four Thirds cameras, legends in their own right, like the Panasonic GH4, also incredibly well-renowned video cameras, were becoming dethroned by Sony's full-frame offering in some cases because of the amount of light that you could shoot in, and thus the darker the scene could be. Sony had something special on their hands with the A7 line, which logically is why they waited 5 years to update it. They waited 5 years to update it. In the S line, we had to be comfortable with what we had because it was a long wait to the A7S III. A7S II, great camera. Love that camera. Hand me that camera on any day, I'll be happy. The next camera on Sony's list has more or less been an elusive camera for myself. Skipping all the way to April 19th, 2017, we have the Sony A9. The Sony A9, unlike the other A7 cameras, which were positioned as semi-professional cameras, the Sony A9 was positioned as a professional camera. And that might surprise you if you look just at the megapixel count. 24.2 megapixels was essentially the same as the A7 camera. So what made this camera so special? Well, this camera was blazing fast. This camera was blisteringly high performance for the time, and it's at this point, market in time, where mirrorless cameras began to outperform DSLRs in photography. The Sony A9 had a lot of the same creature comforts as the A7, with a lot of additional perks. This is the first camera in which Sony introduced its legendary 693 phase detect point autofocus. This is where Sony's autofocus got really good. And how many frames could we shoot before continuously? 2.5 while looking through the viewfinder, like 5 if we weren't. Now, try 20. You could shoot 20 frames per second looking through the viewfinder and 10 FPS on silent mode. This camera shredded through sports photography. It eviscerated high action movement. This camera was a true professional offering. Your viewfinder was laser fast and razor sharp to keep track of all the fast moving images, and the back screen was also much better than before. Sure, the camera weighed a bit more, like it was a bit heavier, but as a professional, I think you can deal with that. This camera was also able to shoot 4K at 24 frames per second. This camera was also able to shoot 4K at 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second with a crop. So if you were looking for kind of an all-encompassing camera, this was it. Oh, I almost forgot. This is the first camera in which Sony launched its modern-day NP-FZ100 battery. So the batteries that they continue to use in 2023 started with this camera. This is the first time I'm going to mention cost in this list. This camera cost $4,500 USD. So professionals, it was sure aimed at. And compared to some of the expensive cameras we have now, $4,500 might seem relatively tame, but when you could shoot video on an A7S II and get slightly better video features for $3,000, it seems like a no-brainer if you're doing video. For photo, this camera was amazing though. It continues to be a competitive camera to this day. and thus begins Sony's takeover era. Sony released some of the most competitive mirrorless cameras in the market that we have ever seen as creators. 2017 was an absolute turning point for not only Sony, but the concept of mirrorless cameras. This is where Sony's quirky experiment turning a long-standing DSLR into a mirrorless became essentially the future. It began with the A7R III, which launched approximately 6 months later in October of 2017. This camera was competitive. It was a great successor to the A7R II. It had a 42 megapixel sensor. This camera had touch focus. It had IBIS. It had fast shooting. You could shoot at 10 FPS without the viewfinder or 8 with. Tiltable screens were in. It shot good 4K video, like good enough. It was smaller, lighter, and in some instances, cheaper than the top-level DSLRs from the other brands. So Sony had a lot of positive momentum moving into the later half of 2017 off the back of these two awesome launches. And then 2018 came around, and Sony lit the world on fire. The A7 III was undoubtedly more people's introduction to Sony cameras than any other camera in the full-frame line. To say the Sony A7 III was popular is an insult to the concept of popularity. This camera was amazing. Uber popular. I bought this camera new. I thought this was incredible, and so did a lot of other people. This is when, at least in my circles, the brand Sony became synonymous with the term hybrid camera, because this camera could really do it all. At the time, you had a 24 megapixel sensor that saw similar upgrades along the line as the other cameras. It was a good sensor. You had touch focus, you had IBIS, you could shoot fast, but you could also record. You could do 4K at 24 or 30, and it was good 4K. Sure, it was 8-bit 4K, but we all learned how to grade 8-bit because that's what was available. It had awesome autofocus for interviews or for live subjects, for photography, for whatever. It was small. It was relatively cheap. The batteries lasted a long time. And to top it all off, this camera launched under $2,000. I've seen professional commercials shot on an A7 III. I've seen incredible works of art created from this piece of technology that in prior years would have been thought of as impossible. This camera ripped apart early offerings from Nikon and Canon, clearly responding off their back foot when trying to develop their early line of mirrorless cameras. The Canon EOS R and early iterations of the Nikon Z6 lacked the features that Sony provided in this mirrorless area, and most importantly, we have to remember that the E-mount launched in 2013, so they started making lenses for the E-mount in 2013. When Nikon and Canon announced their mirrorless lens mounts, they were very new, and therefore there was barely any lenses to choose from. Other brands were having that problem too. Fujifilm not so much. I really liked the X-T3. That was a bit later on, but I remember a little later shopping around in Panasonic's area for cameras like the S1H and realizing that there was just no 24-70 zoom. It just didn't exist for the L mount at the time. Like stuff like that. If you wanted to make the change to mirrorless, which was pretty obviously the future of photography and video at this time, or at least the modern future, you were trying to choose between a good camera with lots of lens support and some good okay cameras with no lenses. It's obvious what people pick. This is when the bulk of my circle got into Sony. This is when a lot of people started interacting with the brand. The Sony A7 III, I'm just going to call it, is the best camera Sony's ever released. So we all sat back after a job well done, and everyone shot on their Sony A7 IIIs for a long time, actually. Sony didn't come out with another full-frame camera until July 16th of 2019. That's over a year and a half later.
Alpha.
When Sony released the A7R IV, and it became clear at this point that Sony is trying to take the megapixel crown. 61 megapixels in a high-resolution camera certainly deserves the R denomination. Sony released an excellent high-resolution photography camera that was a nice iteration on the A7R III, but certainly nothing I would run out to get unless I needed that 61 megapixels. It had updated screen technology, and sure, the viewfinder was a bit better. It had IBIS that was touted as slightly better. It shot at 10 FPS. It was a quality camera and successor to the A7R III. Nothing crazy, but building on the well-established foundation that Sony had now become known for. I don't have a lot to say about this camera. I've never used it, but I'm certain that people have created some awesome things with it.
The Sony Alpha 9 Mark II has improved on perfection.
And then came a familiar sight down the road. The A9 series was back with the Sony A9 II. Now, if you remember, the A9 brought with it a lot of long-time staples in the Sony line. It brought the battery, it brought the high shooting speed. It was an innovator in a lot of different ways for the high-performance photography community. So when this camera came out, a lot of people were looking at it to similarly push the envelope. I mean, let's really see what Sony's capable of. And they did. They really did push it. I'm sure they tried. But for a lot of people, this camera was a pretty lackluster upgrade. For example, it shot at 20 FPS, 20 frames per second with no blackout frames. You could watch the screen the whole time while you were doing that. And if that sounds familiar, it's because the A9 could do that. You got twice as many mechanical shutter frames if you so chose. You got 10 FPS mechanical bursts instead of 5, and there was a ton of small updates to the camera. There was a much better viewfinder, a much higher resolution back touchscreen. You got full width oversampled video, but you still had a crop when you were recording in 30p. Dual SD slots, a true professional offering. And on this camera, the mechanical shutter is rated for 500,000 shots, which I think is the highest rating I've ever heard of on a camera. Leave a comment if you've heard of a camera lasting longer than that. That's an insane amount. Overall, it was a great camera, still is, but not really the industry trendsetter as its predecessor. Speaking of trend-setting, industry-leading cameras, may I introduce the A7S III. Oh, it's that time again. It is that time again. We are back to the A7S line. Thank God, it's only been 5 years. Jokes aside, Sony released the A7 III to immense fanfare. I mean, at this point, the A7S II and the A7 III had built Sony up as a brand to this monolithic stature. Like, everyone was on the Sony hype wagon. When they saw this was being announced, people put their wallets out there. Like, this is an incredible camera. And it's a camera that I currently own and use partially as a backup camera or like a second screen. Now, it's important to note that there was a difference in landscape when the A7S III came out as opposed to the A7S II. When the A7S II came out, high sensitivity 4K low light recording was very much a luxury. That was a camera which at the time had a very small amount of competitors because what it did was so unique. In 2020, brands like Nikon, Canon, Fujifilm, Panasonic, and others had crafted their cameras in a way that they could also be used to create stunning images even in low light. So in terms of what Sony was up against, they needed to knock it out of the park. Do I even need to say how this one went? Sony knocked it out of the park on the A7S III. This camera was awesome, and it is awesome. A lot of photography and creator personalities have heralded this camera as a masterpiece, as essentially the best of what it could be at the time. And I say this camera does what it's meant to do incredibly well. It's got an insanely high resolution 9.44 million dot EVF that you can view from. It shoots 4K video up to 120p. You can output 16-bit raw video and shoot 10-bit internal. That's right, we can finally color grade our footage. Great. They replaced the flippy screen with a fully articulating screen. Thank you, Sony, for listening to us. It's got great active stabilization and a steady shot mode, 2 SD card slots that record, positive iterations on the same great Sony autofocus, and only a slight price increase. I suppose we have to bite the bullet. The camera's bigger, it's bulkier, it's got full HDMI. A lot of people I know in the creator space use this camera as a professional camera, perhaps their sole camera for their business or creative endeavors, and this camera performs. I love the A7S III. I think a lot of people do. Another great move for Sony. And lastly, it got rid of the record limit. You no longer have to reset the camera after 30 minutes. You can record forever. That is a great move. The next camera we have on the list is the smallest camera on the list, the Sony A7C. The Sony A7C, in one phrase, essentially seeks to make the Sony A7 III in a smaller, traditionally crop sensor body. This camera offers a compact size with the same big sensor image quality of the A7 III. It's got essentially the same performance, it's just much smaller. And this is a point where Sony started to put some visual flair into their cameras. I mean, look at that silver top. An interesting iteration of what the E-mount could be. You can still shoot the same great 30 FPS 4K footage. It's got good bursts, but largely this camera came in as a cheaper offering for people looking to buy the A7 III, but wanting something a bit different, a bit cheaper, and updated.
Sony Alpha 1 is the perfect camera. You can have a lot of resolution, it's 50 megapixels.
Now we move into 2021, and Sony didn't take long to make a move. In January, on the 27th, Sony announced the A1. What is the A1? Well, it's the A9, but better. The Sony A1 was announced as Sony's flagship camera. This is the top of the top, the best of the best for what Sony could deliver. And they certainly delivered it. 50.1 megapixel sensors and every bell and whistle to be had. Touch focus, touch menus, 5x image stabilization, 30 FPS shooting, a 1/32,000th electronic shutter. And prepare yourself, this camera in video could record at 8K. It had an incredibly sharp 9.4 million dot viewfinder and an unlimited record time. This camera was an unflinching, no compromises mashup of every one of the best features we had seen, barring a couple specific to the A7S line. And because of that, it launched at $6,500. This camera was very expensive. You knew what you were getting though. You were getting the best of the best, and Sony was delivering in that category. Moving on, we have the next generation of Sony's incredibly popular A7 III, and that's, you guessed it, the A7 IV. The A7 IV is a better A7 III, a much better A7 III. This is an incredible hybrid camera. If you want photography, it's got a 34 megapixel sensor. You're getting a bump. If you want video, it's got similar video specs to the A7S III. Not as good, but hey, you can still shoot 4K 60 in 10-bit. This was also either the first or one of the first cameras to get Sony's new focus breathing compensation, which corrected focus breathing on select Sony lenses. This camera is very much still competitive as of the recording of this video and is a great camera for hybrid shooters. It really makes you ask the question, where are cameras going? There's a couple things that I might change about this. I don't like a crop in video, but like, where do you go after this? This camera is great. There's only a couple compromises.
In its simplest form, photography is just capturing light bouncing off of objects.
And finally, we come to the end. This is the Sony A7R V. I'm really excited to see us enter the 5th generation of these mirrorless cameras. I mean, we've been with them for so long now that like you can really see the thought process, the progression. Watching them stick to a similar body style is just really interesting. It's like growing up with the camera. The A7R V reclaims the resolution cap from the older cameras and says, hey, let's make a 62.5 megapixel sensor. It's official. You can now shoot 8K on an A7 camera. At this point, Sony also started to implement their AI-based real-time tracking autofocus system, which is really interesting. You can output 4K 16-bit, and as you'll see in Sony's marketing, this camera and the future direction of new cameras focuses a lot on improvements in technology and software. I didn't mention this in the other cameras, but features that exist, eye tracking mode in some of the older cameras, now get refined. You have animal tracking, bird tracking, car train recognition, insect recognition, software aspects that could have never been imaginable in the other cameras. Now that we've arrived at the end of the list, I also don't want to discredit the advancements made by the other companies. Like, pretty much all of the other camera brands have been able to keep pace or keep competitive in their offerings, niche or general, with what they've been able to provide in the mirrorless space. I think most people watching this video will agree with me when I say that it's an awesome time to be a video shooter or a photographer in terms of technology. We've come a long way in the last 10 years from when Sony released their first E-mount camera. We've come from what is mirrorless to what is DSLR. Like, I swear to God, I worked with a photographer who had never used a DSLR before. I'm like, no, stop me being old. I hate it. It really puts things into perspective going through the whole lineage of the Alpha line. I'm excited to see what Sony will do next. Send us more Alpha cameras, Sony, please. But that's going to do it for me. What's your favorite Sony Alpha camera? Leave it in the comments below. Or what was your first? God, it'd be nice to go back to the days of the A7 II. Things were a lot simpler back then. If you want me to go through my opinions of other branches of the Sony camera space, FX line, Cine, or whatnot, leave a comment below and I'll make sure to get to them. I read every single one, so if you do leave a comment, I will see it. But other than that, thank you very much for watching my massive list on Sony cameras. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.